There is a strange kind of weakness that does not feel like weakness at all. It doesn't look like collapse. It doesn't look like failure. It doesn't look like fear. It looks like normal life. It looks like restraint, politeness, adaptability, emotional control, agreement, tolerance, stability. It looks like being reasonable. From the outside, it appears functional, responsible, socially acceptable, even admirable. But beneath it, something quieter is happening. A slow shrinking of instinct, a softening of resistance, a subtle retreat from inner authority. Not because anyone ordered it, but because everything around you rewarded it. You learn very early that standing out carries consequences, that silence is safer than clarity, that agreement protects you more than truth, that obedience does not feel like obedience when it is voluntary, so you adapt, not dramatically, not consciously, not rebelliously. You adapt gently, reasonably, gradually. Soften your edges. You adjust your language. You regulate your reactions. You become easier to live with, easier to manage, easier to predict. And slowly, without noticing, strength begins to feel inappropriate. Not wrong, not immoral, just inconvenient. In a world that values harmony, strength feels disruptive. In a culture built on emotional stability, strength feels dangerous. In systems that require cooperation, strength feels unnecessary. This is not how weakness is usually described. We imagine weakness as collapse, as fragility, as incapacity, but the most effective weakness doesn't look broken. It looks well-adjusted. It looks calm, controlled, composed, civilized. It looks like a person who knows how to survive inside systems but has forgotten how to stand outside them. Arthur Schopenhauer understood something unsettling about human societies. They do not train people to be strong. They train people to be manageable, not through violence, not through force, not through chains, but through psychology, through reward, through belonging, through fear of isolation, through emotional conditioning. And the result is not a population of slaves, but a population of compliant minds, people who believe they are choosing restraint, when restraint has already been chosen for them, people who believe they are free, because they are comfortable, people who believe they are strong, because they are functioning. Before we go further, pause for a moment. If you're drawn to these questions, if this feels familiar in a way you can't quite explain, this space exists for people willing to sit with that discomfort, not to fix it, not to escape it, but to understand it. Now let's begin. Most obedience today is invisible. No one commands you. No one threatens you. No one forces compliance. You simply learn what is acceptable. You learn what reactions are rewarded, what emotions are welcomed, what thoughts are safe to express, what doubts are better left unspoken. This is not repression. It is conditioning, and conditioning works best when it feels natural. From childhood you are taught how to belong, not explicitly but emotionally. Approval becomes a compass. Disapproval becomes a warning system. You learn when to speak, when to stop, when to soften your tone, when to adjust your posture, when to hide intensity. Not because anyone tells you directly, but because you feel the response or look. A pause, a change in warmth, a subtle withdrawal or approval. Over time, you internalize this feedback and eventually you no longer need external correction. You correct yourself. This is where obedience stops being external and becomes psychological. Schopenhauer believed that the deepest control is not imposed, it is absorbed. People begin regulating themselves in advance. They filter their thoughts before they reach language. They restrain impulses before they reach action. They dilute certainty before it becomes conviction, not because they are weak, but because they are trained to survive socially. The modern individual is not oppressed. They are calibrated to environments, to systems, to expectations, to norms that they learn how much strength is too much, how much clarity is too sharp, how much independence feels threatening, so they moderate themselves, they become acceptable, and this acceptability becomes identity. You are not told to be small. You are taught to be reasonable. You are not told to submit. You are taught to be cooperative. You are not told to suppress instinct. You are taught to be civilized. Weakness, in this form, is not humiliation, it is adaptation. An adaptation, when repeated long enough, becomes personality. People begin to believe they are naturally cautious, naturally restrained, naturally hesitant, naturally compliant. But what feels natural is often learned. Schopenhauer saw this as the first tragedy of modern society. People no longer know where their limits came from. They mistake conditioning for character. They mistake fear for morality, restraint for wisdom, compliance for virtue, and because the training is invisible, it is never questioned. The result is a society of individuals who believe they are choosing weaknesses, when weakness has already been installed as normality. Weaknesses does not begin as weakness, it begins as intelligence, as adaptation, as survival. Every human system teaches one primary lesson: belonging keeps you safe. Not physically, but socially, emotionally, economically, psychologically. You learn very early that exclusion is dangerous, not because it kills you, but because it isolates you. And isolation is one of the deepest human fears. So you learn to adapt, you learn to read rooms, to anticipate reactions, to adjust behavior, to sense when intensity is welcome and when it is not. This is not cowardice, it is social intelligence. But Schopenhauer understood the danger when survival depends on adaptation. Adaptation replaces authenticity. You stop asking who you are. You ask what works. You stop asking what is true. You ask what is acceptable. You stop asking what you believe. You ask what will keep you included. This is how survival becomes submission, not through force, but through necessity. You submit not to authority, but to environment. You align not with power, but with expectation. Over time, you become fluent in self-modulation. You know how much of yourself to show, how much to hide, how much to dilute, how much to restrain, and this becomes identity, not consciously, not intentionally, not dramatically, quietly, but you begin confusing safety with goodness, approval with truth, belonging with meaning. And strength starts to feel irresponsible, because strength risks isolation, strength risks misunderstanding, strength risks exclusion, so weakness becomes strategic, not weakness as collapse, but weakness as adaptation. Schopenhauer saw modern society as a system that rewards manageability. People who are predictable thrive, people who are compliant integrate, people who are agreeable advance, not because they are better, but because they are easier to organize. Systems prefer stability over clarity. They prefer harmony over honesty. They prefer cooperation over strength. And the individual learns this quickly. You learn that resistance complicates life, that independence isolates you, that clarity attracts conflict, so you soften, you adjust. You submit not to rulers, not to laws, not to threats, but to structure, to the shape of the world around you. When this submission feels voluntary, that is the illusion. You believe you are choosing peace. When you are choosing predictability, you believe you are choosing maturity. When you are choosing compliance, you believe you are choosing stability. When you are choosing submission, Schopenhauer believed this was the core deception. People are not forced into weakness. They are trained into it, through reward, through belonging, through comfort, through safety, until weakness feels like wisdom, and strength feels dangerous. Control no longer looks like domination, that it looks like convenience, it looks like comfort, it looks like ease, it looks like emotional safety, it looks like a life without friction. Modern systems do not suppress people, they soothe them. They do not demand obedience, they offer relief. They do not enforce silence, they provide noise. Schopenhauer believed that human beings prefer pleasure to truth, not because they are weak, but because truth is heavy. Truth requires endurance, attention, solitude, confrontation with discomfort. Comfort requires none of that. Comfort dissolves tension. It softens edges. It reduces resistance. It makes life manageable. So society reorganizes itself around it. Discomfort becomes abnormal. Struggle becomes pathology. Resistance becomes dysfunction. The modern individual is taught not to endure but to avoid. Avoid pain. Avoid conflict. Avoid tension. Avoid silence. Avoid stillness. Everything is designed to distract, soothe, stabilize. Not to awaken. Not to challenge. Not to strengthen. Schopenhauer saw comfort as a psychological anesthetic. It dulls the instinct to confront reality. It replaces confrontation with consumption, reflection with entertainment, depth with stimulation. When people are comfortable, they are compliant. not because they are controlled, but because they are sedated. Comfort creates dependency. You become dependent on ease, on predictability, on emotional stability. Disruption begins to feel threatening, even when it is truthful, even when it is necessary, even when it is clarifying. So, strength begins to look like danger, not because it harms, but because it disturbs comfort. Clarity disrupts peace. Independence disrupts order. Silence disrupts noise, and systems built on comfort cannot tolerate disruption, so they reward softness. They reward flexibility. They reward emotional moderation. They reward psychological safety, not resilience, not endurance, not inner stability, but external stability. Schopenhauer believed this creates a fragile society, not fragile in appearance, but fragile in foundation, because comfort does not build strength. It builds dependence. It trains people to require protection from reality, to need buffers, to need filters, to need mediation. The more comfort increases, the less tolerance for discomfort remains. And the less tolerance for discomfort remains, the more weakness becomes normalized. People no longer develop inner strength. They outsource stability to systems, to platforms, to institutions, to structures. The individual becomes psychologically smaller, while the system becomes larger. Not through force, but through relief. This is how control modernizes. It no longer needs to dominate bodies. It manages attention, emotion, focus, desire. Then when those are managed, behavior follows naturally. Understood that a comfortable population does not revolt. It adapts, it complies. Adjusts. That it becomes manageable, not because it is oppressed, but because it is protected. And protection, when excessive, becomes dependency. Weakness is no longer framed as limitation. It is framed as virtue. Modern society does not say, "You are weak," it says, "You are sensitive, you are kind, you are gentle, you are empathetic, you are understanding." These are not insults, they are moral badges. But Schopenhauer saw something darker beneath this shift. When weakness becomes moralized, strength becomes suspect, restraint becomes righteousness, avoidance becomes wisdom, submission becomes goodness. Not because strength is cruel, but because strength is disruptive. Strength does not negotiate emotionally. It does not seek approval. It does not require validation. And systems built on emotional alignment cannot tolerate that. So weakness is reframed as morality. Compliance becomes compassion. Silence becomes humility. Passivity becomes peace. And resistance becomes aggression. Independence becomes arrogance. Clarity becomes cruelty. Not because it is, but because it refuses emotional consensus. Schopenhauer believed morality had been inverted, not in law but in psychology. Goodness no longer meant integrity. It meant alignment. It meant fitting, in agreeing, synchronizing emotionally. Those who adapt are praised. Those who resist are corrected, not punished but socially reframed. They are labeled difficult, cold, detached, insensitive, not because they harm but because they do not perform emotional conformity. This creates a powerful internal pressure. People begin moderating themselves morally. Not asking, "Is this true?" but "Is this acceptable?" Not asking, "Is this right?" but "How will this be perceived?" Moral behavior becomes social behavior. Ethics becomes optics. And weakness becomes identity. People begin protecting their limitations as values. They defend fragility. They rationalize dependence. They moralize hesitation, not because they are dishonest, but because they have adapted. Schopenhauer saw this as the final trick. When weakness becomes virtue, people will defend it. They will justify it, protect it, normalize it. They will resist strength, not as threat, but as immorality. And this creates a self-sustaining system. Weakness no longer needs to be enforced. It is culturally protected. It is socially rewarded. It is morally framed. Strength, meanwhile, becomes lonely, not persecuted but isolated, not attacked but misunderstood, not forbidden but unwelcome. And slowly, society forgets what strength even looks like. It confuses noise with power, aggression with confidence, control with stability. True strength, quiet, grounded, independent, becomes invisible, because it does not perform, because it does not signal, because it does not conform. Strength does not fail first. Belonging fails first. Most people do not abandon strength because it is difficult. They abandon it because it is isolating. To stand firmly in one's own perception is to accept the possibility of standing alone, not dramatically, not heroically, Not romantically, but quietly, in ordinary life, in conversations, in relationships, in social spaces, in workplaces, in families. Schopenhauer understood that human beings fear isolation more than error. Being wrong feels safer in a group than being right alone. Agreement offers warmth. Shared belief offers shelter. Collective certainty offers psychological safety. Strength offers none of these. Strength offers solitude. It offers distance from emotional synchronization, distance from collective urgency, distance from shared narratives. And most people are not trained for solitude. They are trained for connection. For responsiveness, for emotional alignment, for mutual reassurance. So when strength begins to separate them from familiar emotional rhythms, it feels threatening, not because it harms them, but because it disconnects them. You begin to feel different, not superior, not special, just out of place. You notice that your silences feel longer, your reactions slower, your certainty quieter. You stop rushing to agree. You stop needing to react. You stop matching emotional tempo. And this creates friction, not conflict, but distance. People feel it before they name it. You are still present, but less synchronized. Still listening, but less responsive. Still involved, but not aligned. Schopenhauer believed this was the moment most people retreat, not because they are weak, but because they are human. The fear of losing connection outweighs the desire for clarity, so they return. They soften again. They synchronize. They choose belonging over autonomy, not consciously, not explicitly, but emotionally. Because isolation feels like danger, connection feels like survival. This is how weakness becomes safety, not because people are incapable of strength, but because strength feels socially expensive. It costs warmth. It costs ease. It costs familiarity. It costs emotional proximity. So people trade it not for comfort, but for closeness, and closeness becomes the highest value, not truth, not clarity, not independence. But inclusion. Schopenhauer saw this as the deepest tragedy. People abandon themselves not under threat, but under the promise of belonging. They shrink not from fear, but from desire for connection. They weaken not from oppression, but from longing. And this weakness feels justified. Because it feels kind, because it feels relational. Because it feels human, but it also keeps people small. Eventually, society no longer needs to shape you. You shape yourself by this point. Weakness is no longer external pressure, it is internal habit. You censor thoughts before they form. You soften opinions before they solidify. You restrain impulses before they surface. Not because someone told you to, but because it feels natural. This is the final stage of training. When control no longer feels like control. When submission no longer feels like submission. When limitation no longer feels imposed. Schopenhauer believed this was the deepest loss. Not freedom, but awareness of freedom. You stop noticing what you've given up. You stop remembering what strength felt like. You confuse calm with peace, restraint with wisdom, adaptation with maturity, and weakness becomes identity. People begin defending it. They justify their smallness as humility, their hesitation as morality, their passivity as kindness, not dishonestly but sincerely, because it feels true. Because it feels safe, because it feels familiar. And strength begins to feel foreign. Almost dangerous. Almost irresponsible, almost unnatural. The individual becomes psychologically smaller, but socially stable, internally constrained, but externally functional. This is the success of the system. Not broken people, but regulated people. Not rebels but participants, not thinkers but adapters, not free minds but manageable ones. Schopenhauer saw this not as cruelty, but as efficiency. A society does not need strong individuals to function smoothly. It needs predictable ones, compliant ones, emotionally synchronized ones. And so weakness becomes normal, not dramatic, not tragic, not visible. Just ordinary. Daily. Routine. Accepted. And by the time someone senses something is wrong, they cannot name it, because nothing looks broken. Life continues. Systems function. Order remains. Only something inside feels quieter, smaller, less alive. But even that feels inappropriate to say, so it remains unspoken, unexamined, internalized. Strength no longer looks like power, it looks like distance, it looks like silence. It looks like emotional independence. It looks like not reacting, not explaining, not seeking validation. And that is precisely why it feels threatening. Modern systems understand emotion better than they understand reason. They can manage outrage, channel fear, direct desire, amplify anxiety, reward conformity, but they cannot easily manage detachment. A person who is angry can be guided. A person who is afraid can be controlled. A person who is hopeful can be mobilized, but a person who is internally independent is difficult to place. They do not respond on cue. They do not escalate. They do not synchronize emotionally, remain unreadable, and unreadability creates uncertainty. Schopenhauer believed that societies do not fear aggression, they fear non-participation, because participation sustains structure, attention keeps systems alive, reaction maintains relevance, emotional investment fuels continuity. When someone withdraws from emotional obligation, they do not attack the system, they simply stop feeding it. No outrage, no rebellion, no slogans, no resistance narrative. Just distance, and that distance destabilizes rhythm. Conversations change, relationships shift, expectations soften, authority hesitates. Not because power collapses, but because its signals no longer land strength. In this form is not force. It is non-dependence. Third, ability to remain grounded without needing emotional reinforcement. This kind of strength does not seek dominance, that it seeks autonomy, and autonomy is dangerous to systems built on alignment. So it is framed negatively. As arrogance, as coldness, as indifference, as lack of empathy, not because it harms, but because it does not comply emotionally. Schopenhauer understood this inversion. Society does not eliminate strength, it isolates it, makes it socially expensive. It surrounds it with suspicion that trains people to associate independence with danger. And dependence with goodness. So most people retreat. Not from weakness, but from the cost of strength. Because strength now requires standing without emotional protection. Without reinforcement, without validation, without collective agreement. And most people were never trained for that, they were trained for belonging. The world does not fall apart when people become weaker, it becomes smoother, more stable, more predictable, more manageable. Life continues, systems function, institutions endure, structures remain intact. This is the quiet arrangement. Weakness is not imposed, it is rewarded, not dramatically, not visibly, not violently, but gently. Through safety, through comfort, through belonging, through moral language, through emotional approval. And because it works, no one names it as a problem. People live their lives, build careers, form relationships, create identities. Everything appears functional, only something subtle is missing. Not success, not productivity, not stability. But depth. Autonomy. Inner authority. Schopenhauer believed this was the final outcome, a society that does not need strong individuals because it no longer values strength, a culture that does not fear weakness because weakness maintains order. People are not broken, they are adapted. Not enslaved. But conditioned. Not oppressed, but shaped. And the most unsettling truth is this: nothing in this system feels cruel, nothing feels violent, nothing feels violent, feels extreme. It feels normal, reasonable, civilized. Civilized. That is why it persists. This is not a call to resist, not a demand to awaken, not an invitation to rebel. It is only an observation that much of what we call morality, stability, and social harmony is built on a quiet agreement to remain smaller than we could be, and once that is seen, it cannot be unseen, not because it changes your life suddenly, but because it changes how you understand why life feels the way it does.